Basics of Python, Lesson 1. Hello everyone. This course introduces Python-based web development practice, mainly including 5 parts. The first is the basics of Python, and then we will introduce the basics of web development using Python, as well as the principle and real-world example of web crawling in scientific computing and automated DevOps in Python. Today, let's start with the basics of Python. It has 4 parts. First of all, the history of Python programming language and the features of it. And how to set up a and then Python development features of it and how to set up a Python development environment on Alibaba Cloud ECS. In the end, we'll have 2 simple Python examples. So let's take a look at the history of Python. The first thing we need to know is why we choose Python. On the left side of this page is a pyramid model. From the bottom up, you can see it includes data acquisition and collection, data processing, data modeling, and data visualization. At every single level, we will see the position of Python and we will briefly introduce its advantages. Let's first introduce the data collection and acquisition. We can store and obtain data through databases, including relational databases and non-relational databases. We can also use web crawlers to fetch data. We can use Python or Java to do that. At the data processing level, we can use the standard SQL language to do simple data statistics and queries. We can also write code to complete more complex and flexible data processing tasks. We can use Python, R, SAS, etc. Keep going up. At the data modeling level, there are some dedicated tools with GUI to do data modeling, or we can write code to do it. For example, SPSS is a software tool providing graphical interfaces, and the R language is a dedicated programming language for data modeling. But both of them are for the specific domain. They are not generic tools or language. To pick up a generic programming language for data modeling, the choice is Python in most cases. After the data processing, we may need to do some data visualization work. Some offline tools are providing graphical interfaces. For example, Microsoft Excel and PowerPoint. We can use them to visualize the data. And some programming languages can be used for offline data visualization, including R, SAS, Java, Python, etc. On the other hand, we can use some online tools, which means web browser-based visualization tools. One example is eCharts. From this page, we can see that Python can be used at every single stage, from data collection, processing, to modeling and visualization. In this way, we can see Python is a full-stack language for software development. Secondly, why we choose Python? Let's first look at what Python is. Python is an advanced programming language. What features does Python have? First of all, it is an interpreted programming language. It is an object-oriented, dynamic, and high-level programming language. What is an interpreted language? It means that it is executed while interpreting, and there is no compilation process. Design. We all know that Python supports object-oriented design. We all know that object-oriented programming ideas are the mainstream programming ideas in the domain of software design and development. Dynamics refers to the standard libraries that the Python interpreter relies on where it runs. Compared with assembly languages, high-level languages are much more convenient and easier for a human to use. Besides, Python is good at data analysis and the development of intelligent hardware programs. Below, we can see several examples of Python applications, including data analysis, web application development, game development, and intelligent hardware and software development, and so on. Next, let's take a look at the history of Python. It is interesting. The author of Python is Rossum, who likes to watch a British soap opera called The Flying Circus. So he named his new language as Python. The first version of Python was officially released in 1995. And actually, the Java language was first released in 1995, which is 4 years younger than Python. But in fact, the development of Python was mainly completed in recent years. The creator of Python, Guido van Rossum, was in Amsterdam during Christmas in 1989 to spend the Christmas time. He decided to develop a new interpreted language, and then he created Python's predecessor. Compared with the C language, Python is an interpreted language and does not need to be compiled. At the same time, it can also call the standard library of the C language. So Python has obvious advantages. Later, the Python language developed the 2.x series and the 3.x series. Python 2 was released in October 2000, and it will no longer be maintained in 2022. In December 2008, Python 3 was released. This version was not fully compatible with the previous one, i.e. Python 2. Therefore, Python was divided into Python 3.5 faction and Python 2.7 faction, forming two camps. So what are the major differences between the two? Python 3 has built-in support for Unicode characters, so Python 3 has an advantage in internationalization. Then Python 3 uses an absolute path to support. Then it uses more strict indentation, making the code style more standardized. And Python 3 encapsulated and replaced some functions of Python 2, for example, print, exec, etc. Therefore, during development, Python 3 programs have a more rigorous and unified style. So far, most of the Python engineers have moved to use Python 3 and Python 2 will gradually withdraw from the stage of history. Next, let's take a look at the popularity of the Python language. This graph is based on the TIOB index to show the community activity of each programming language. We can see that the Python language has developed rapidly after 2018 and is currently in the top 3 positions. Let's take a look at the requirements for a programming language to be covered by the TIOB index. To be on the ranking list, there are 2 requirements. First, there must be a separate entry on the wiki, and it indicates that it is a programming language. Second, this language is turning complete. What factors does TIOB use to decide the popularity of a programming language? It is mainly based on the average number of search results for the language on 8 major websites, divided by the total number of search results for the first 50 languages. So we can see that in such a standardized ranking, the development of the Python language is still very fast. Python was named the Programming Language of the Year by the TIOB in 2007, 2010, 2018, and 2019. It is also the programming language that has won the most awards in history. As of October 2020, Python has become the 3rd most popular programming language. The following feature is the popularity of Python alone. We can see that after 2018, the flow of Python is indeed rising rapidly. Let's look at the market demand and the salaries of each programming language. We can see that the Python language is now ranked 2nd with a salary of $64,000. Next, let's take a look at the features of Python. First of all, let's have a look at the advantages of the Python programming language. Its first advantage is simplicity, which is also the most important advantage of the Python language. So its learning cost and learning curve are relatively lower. Python follows a simple, elegant, and a clear design philosophy. Therefore, data analysts, web development engineers, etc. can get rid of the obstacles of program syntax, rules, and carry out project development faster. Let's take a look at the picture on the right. The one on the left is the C language. If we want to print the string hello world, we must first have a main function. Then we use 2 braces to wrap such a line of code, print hello world. So we used 4 lines of code to print a string. But let's look at what we can do with the Python language. As long as line of code is enough, it is print hello world. So it avoids some of the complexity of programming syntax, which is the characteristic of concise in Python. Its second advantage is that it has a rich standard library. We know that programming is based on predecessors, and we don't need to develop most of the basic functions from scratch. It is also because the Python community has a high degree of activity, which brings a very rich standard library. It mainly includes a complete basic code library, covering a lot of content such as network communication, file processing, database interface, graphics system, and XML processing. Therefore, these standard libraries, also known as built-in batteries, are ready to use out of the box. Python programmers are also known as the package man, or the API caller. That is, as a Python programmer, you only need to be familiar with the API of these standard libraries to use all these built-in functions. In the picture on the right, we can see Python's rich standard libraries, including mathematical operations related, including math, statistics, and random numbers, as well as 5 system related, including file compression, decompression, and file input, etc., as well as data type related, text processing related, file format related, operating system level, and other corresponding standard libraries. Programmers only need to call them. Its third advantage is that it's a high-level programming language. Compared with the C language, it's a high-level programming language. Python sacrifices performance but improves the efficiency of programmers. It allows the programmers to focus on programming without paying attention to the underlying details. So its programming is very efficient. This also brings a problem. That is, its execution efficiency will be relatively low. However, given the current improvement in the performance of mainstream hardware, execution efficiency seems less important in many cases. In the picture on the right, we define a bicycle class. This class contains some attributes and behaviors, or member variables and methods. So, this is an example of object-oriented design. The fourth advantage is that the Python language is open source and free. Python is open source software that meets the FLOSS standard. It allows free distribution and archive, reading and modifying the code, and it can be used in part for new free software. The new software system we developed based on the Python language is also free and open source. The fifth advantage is that it is executed while compiling. Because Python is an interpreted language, it is executed while compiling. Interpretation execution only requires source code, so debugging and maintenance are very easy. The picture on the right introduces the difference between compilation and interpretation execution. For compiled languages, such as C and C++, we first need to compile the source code into machine code and then run it. For interpreted languages such as Python, PHP, etc., we only need to hand over the source code to the interpreter, and then the interpreter can execute it directly. The sixth advantage is its portability and embeddability. That is, as long as there is a Python interpreter in the operating environment, the source code can run on any operating system, so its portability is outstanding. Then Python can also be embedded into C and C++ to provide scraping functions. So such a cross-language embedding is also a great advantage. After the advantages, let's see what its disadvantages are. In fact, for the Python programming language, its biggest disadvantage is that it runs slower, because it is executed while interpreting, and its underlying layer may also rely on the C or C++ libraries. Therefore, the logic flow of its execution will be relatively long, so its running speed will be a little slower. Then the second disadvantage is with its indentation rules. Unlike the C language or Java, they use braces to express the logical structure. Python uses the indentation rule to express the logic structure. So for the indentation rule, if you do not pay enough attention to strictly follow it, there will be errors. For example, the picture on the right, if true print write, then if true itself is a code block that requires the internal code to be indented. If there is no indentation at the time, Python will report an error. This is the indentation error. And then let's see the following one. The indentation is corrected, so this code can be executed correctly. Then the third disadvantage is the multi-thread disaster. This is because there is a global lock in the CPython interpreter, which will cause only one thread to execute at the same time. So its multi-thread design is not as convenient as Java or C. And the fourth one is that it is difficult to encrypt. This is also because it is an interpreting language. It is not like compiled language. For compiled language, when its source code is compiled into an executable program, there is an encryption process. Python, on the other hand, runs the source code directly, so it's difficult to encrypt the source code. These are four main downsides of Python, but in fact, these downsides do not affect Python getting popular. Next, let's take a look at the 10 programming philosophies of Python. The first is that beautiful is better than ugly, which is Python aims to write beautiful code. We don't need to write complex and obscure code. We just need to format it beautifully enough. The second is that explicit is better than implicit. That is, beautiful code is of course explicit and clear, and its naming convention and style are consistent. Then simple is better than complicated. That is, in programming, we don't need to present this complex code logic, but do this layer by layer object-oriented encapsulation, so the simplicity of the code is better. For the rest of these 10 philosophies, I want to go through them one by one. You can understand and feel them after you start programming in Python. Then let's look at a comparison between Python and Java. First of all, Java is compiled, while Python is interpreted. So in Java, the source code needs to go through a compiler to be converted into a target program. Then we can run the target program on the machine. For Python, it is executed by directly feeding the source code as an input to the interpreter. Next, the second difference is that in Python, everything is an object. That is, in Python, functions, modules, and numbers, etc. are all objects. In Java, functions and basic data types are not objects. So strictly speaking, the Python language is more object-oriented. Let's continue with the comparison. Here are the code blocking method, portability, and application scenarios. Let's look at the difference between Python and Java. Firstly, Java uses braces to separate code blocks, while Python uses indentation. I have to see one disadvantage of indentation is that You may see more syntax errors because it is easier to put wrong indents. On the other hand, the advantage is that it can reduce the line count of a function. That is, to implement the same function if it is developed through Python, its code size is much less than Java. The second is portability. Because Python is an interpreter language, there is an interpreter who reads the source code and executes it. For any operating system, as long as the Python interpreter can be ported to it, all the Python programs can run on it. As you know, Java programs run on the Java runtime environment. Java claims to be compile once, run anywhere, which is actually compile once, run whenever the Java runtime environment is ported to. Because the Python interpreter and the Java runtime environment are both ported to all the major platforms, you can see both Python programs and the Java programs are having good portability. We don't see much difference here. The third is the application scenario. Java is more popular to develop large-scale business systems with complex business logic, such as banking software, ERP systems, etc. Python is suitable for lightweight tasks like web development, data analysis, and computing tasks, such as scientific computing and the development of AI algorithms, etc. Next, let's have a look at the comparison between Python and the R language. As you know, the R programming language is very popular in the field of data analysis. Python is also playing a very important role in the data analysis field. So what are the differences between them? Firstly, Python is a sharp weapon for machine learning because it has a wealth of standard libraries, cutting-edge algorithm models, and so on. Python is stronger than the R language on this point. On the other hand, R is good at statistics and inference. It has rich statistical function libraries, such as time series analysis, etc. However, it doesn't have other general-purpose libraries. For example, R is not often used to handle other problems like data analysis, machine learning, etc. Furthermore, Python is also known for its simplicity because its programming ideas are relatively straightforward and simple. Its syntax is quite similar to human language, so its learning cost is relatively low. At the same time, its engineering capacity is relatively strong because it has good portability and it is possible to be embedded into other languages. And compared to the R language, Python's performance is relatively better. So Python is better at handling big data. On the other hand, the R language is lacking generality. That is, except for data analysis, its application is quite limited. But Python can also be used to develop web applications. R's community is also less active than Python. Now let's look at the difference between the application scenarios of Python and R. In fact, R language mainly does the kind of statistical analysis and interactive charts and dashboards, but Python can be used for web crawlers, data connection, and API, etc. So Python has many more application scenarios. Next, let's take a look at how to set up a Python programming environment on ECS. When talking about a Python development environment and package management, firstly, let's see what tools do we have. Let's start with the runtime environment and package management tools. The runtime environment means the environment that a Python program depends on so that it is possible to run on a computer system. It is not the Python development environment. We usually use Anaconda to manage the runtime environment. Using Anaconda, we can install the Python interpreter, and we can configure the Python environment and manage the dependencies of Python packages, etc. Then talk about the Python development environment. Python development environment means the environment inside which can develop Python programs. The Python development environment usually provides a runtime environment. On top of it, it can provide a visual editing tool. Here I listed 5 of the most popular Python development environments, including IPython, Qt Console, PyCharm, Jupyter Notebook, and Spider. We will talk about their differences later. Firstly, let's start with IPython. IPython is an interactive development environment based on Python's built-in shell. IPython encourages a working model of execute explore. As soon as you input the source code, press enter, then you will immediately get the result of the code. So such an interactive programming environment is mostly used for learning the Python language. You may not want to use it for product development. We want to introduce the usage of IPython because it provides a very powerful interactive Python shell, and it can also be used for Jupyter notebooks. So about the major functions that IPython provides, firstly, we can use it as an enhanced Python console and execute a Python program on this console. We can also use IPython as a shell of the system. Then the third one is that we can also check the history of the Python script we ever executed. And IPython also provides the function of the tab auto completion. That is, we can press tab key to let IPython complete the code for us. And it has more advanced usages. For example, to run a script through %run, etc. Here won't dig into the whole details. You can always check the details easily. That is, after entering IPython on the command line to launch it. When you enter a question mark in the IPython shell, you will get a very detailed introduction to IPython. If you enter %quickref in IPython, you will get the quick reference of IPython. For example, some magic function calls provided by IPython. And if you enter help, and you will get the full help document of IPython. What if we want to check the help information for the specific package only? We can get that by adding a question mark to the package name, then press enter. For example, I want to get the information about a package called pandas. Then we enter pandas question mark. Then you see here the help document of it is displayed. After IPython, let's have a look at the introduction of the Qt console, another Python development environment. Qt console is not very popular. In fact, it is an interactive programming environment providing a GUI built with Qt framework, and it is often used as a plugin for IPython and Jupyter. It provides some rich text editing features to the programming running in the terminal. For example, inline pictures, multi-line editing, syntax highlighting, etc. As a comparison, IPython, which will be introduced just now, is a pure text editor, not a rich text editor. Next, let's see the installation of Qt console. It can be installed through conda. The command is conda install Qt console. It can also be installed through pip. You can see the command here too. Then, about the launch of Qt console, we can use Jupyter, like what you can see here, Jupyter Qt console. In the end, the major disadvantage of Qt console is that it is not providing so many features, and it is still not so user-friendly. So Qt console is not often used as a standalone Python development environment, but is a plugin for Jupyter or IPython, as I mentioned before. Next, let's take a look at Jupyter. Jupyter is a widely used, especially Jupyter Notebook, which is a web application for interactive computing. It can be applied from end to end in interactive computing, including the development, the documentation, and the program execution, and the display of the results. This means we can finish the whole procedure of a Python application software development in a web browser, from end to end. What features is Jupyter Notebook having? Let's see. It has syntax highlighting, indentation, and tab completion when programming. This will be quite convenient to use. Secondly, it runs the code inside the web browser. At the same time, it displays the execution results right below the code block. So it's quite interactive. Thirdly, it can display the execution results in a rich media style. Rich media here include SVG, etc. We can see the style to show the execution results in Jupyter Notebook is very rich. Then the fourth one is about documentation. As we all know, documents are usually very important deliveries for software projects. Jupyter Notebook supports writing any document using Markdown syntax. For example, you can write an introduction document about the design or architecture of your software, or you can write a user manual. Even more, Jupyter Notebook also supports a LaTeX syntax to write mathematical formulas. So we can see Jupyter Notebook is very powerful. And since it is an interactive programming environment, you can see the result in no time when you are writing your code. That's why Jupyter is a popular tool for Python programming. Actually, about Jupyter, that's not all of it. Jupyter is a development tool for Julia, Python, and R language. That is to say, it not only supports the development with Python, it is also possible to support the development with R language. This is cool, but that's not something we're going to talk about today. What we are going to talk about next is the two most powerful integrated development environments, PyCharm and Spider. PyCharm and Spider are both integrated development environments. What does that mean? An integrated development environment is a desktop software, and it provides all the tools for development, for source code writing, running, and debugging the program, to even package management. When you write a source code in an IDE, what you will get includes syntax highlighting, keyword auto-completion, etc. All these features greatly improve the developer's productivity. In these two IDEs, the difference between them is not so big. The main difference is with the style of the workflow. Different people may have different preferences on that. PyCharm is one of the most famous integrated development software of Python. It provides a set of tools that can help the developer to greatly improve their efficiency or productivity when using the Python language. The main features include coding assistance, project navigation, code analysis, version control, etc. Spider is another great tool. It provides similar functions to those of PyCharm. But it is unique in that it is especially optimized for data science workflow, and it has a similar interface to MATLAB, which can view variables in real time, so it is very suitable for the data analysis tasks. After that, let's go to the package management tool, Anaconda. Anaconda helps us to very easily obtain packages and manage the package dependencies. It also makes it easy to manage different Python environments between different installations. It can do that by creating different virtual environments, and these virtual environments can be taken as sandboxes. The resources between them are isolated from each other. For example, CI created a virtual environment A. Inside environment A, I can install all the dependent packages required by project A. And at the same time, I can create a virtual environment B, and then inside it, install all the different packages that project B depends on. Anaconda ensures the isolation of packages between these two virtual environments, which is very helpful to run multiple projects at the same time. After the introduction of all these tools, let's take a look at how to set up a Python development environment on the Alibaba Cloud ECS. You may ask, what is ECS? ECS stands for Elastic Computer Service. It is the cloud computing service provided by Alibaba. Maybe you can just take it as a server on the cloud. So first of all, we need to log into Alibaba Cloud with your account and a credential. Then you will get a resource from the ECS of Alibaba Cloud. After logging in on the Alibaba Cloud web page, here you can see the count of the instances of the running ECS. You can click it, then you will see all the specific information about this instance, including something like its public network IP. And this time, you can take note of this IP because it is very important. That is, when you want to log into this ECS instance remotely, you will have to use the IP address. Like the example here, this is how you can log into the ECS server of Alibaba Cloud. You can see here we're using the command SSH, which is the most common remote login tool. Its usage is just like what is showed here. You put the command SSH, then space, then the username on the server. Its root, in this example, then then the public IP address, which you noted just now. Then press enter. It will ask you for the password. Provide it, and you will log into this ECS instance of Alibaba Cloud. After logging into the ECS server, we need to install the Python environment. In this example, the ECS server has a Linux system of Ubuntu. On Ubuntu, we use apt to install Python 3 package with all its dependencies. After the installation is done, we can try to launch it to verify the installation. We can start a shell interface of Python 3, and then try to print hello world, just like this, from what is highlighted in these red boxes. In the first red box, there is the command to install the Python 3 software on this ECS instance. After the installation is successful, we can enter the Python shell interface through a command of Python 3, and then enter the statement of print hello world and press enter. Then we can immediately see the printed string of hello world, just like here. The Python shell is also an interactive Python programming environment. Then through the exit function, we can exit the current Python shell programming environment. Okay, after Python 3 is installed, let's see how to install the IPython development environment. Since Python 3 is installed, we can just use the command pip to install IPython. Just like the example, the command is pip install IPython. Pip will install IPython and manage all its dependencies. Just as usual, after the installation is done, we need to verify it. We can enter the command IPython on the command line. Then you will see the shell programming interface of IPython. It looks similar to the Python shell, and it is an interactive programming environment as well. Just like before, we enter print hello world and press enter. You can see here the hello world string is printed. And the same as before, we can enter the exit function to exit the current IPython programming environment. After IPython, let's take a look at how to install Jupyter on ECS. We can use the same Python package management command here. That is pip. As you can see, pip install Jupyter. So at this point, you may already know that to install Python itself, we need to use the software management tool of the system. From what we did, apt is the software management tool on Ubuntu. You may need to use different tools for different Linux distribution. For example, Yum is used on Red Hat Linux, like CentOS. And after Python gets installed successfully, then you can use the package management tool of Python itself to install different Python packages. The most popular tool is pip. As we did just now, you may also use Conda, which will be available after Anaconda is installed. Now that the Python development environment is ready, let's look at two simple Python examples. Firstly, let's start with echo. The function of echo is very simple. That is, we let the user enter a string from the console, and then our program prints what the user just entered on the screen. That's why it is called echo. Here on the right, you can see the source code of echo. You can see the first line of the program is to set coding to UTF-8, which means the encoding format of this Python program. We often use UTF-8 coding, which is almost a convention. In the next lesson, we will explain what encoding means in Python source code. You don't need to understand it now. After the first line, let's see the following three lines. The first line is while true. It is an always true loop, which means the loop will always continue. So the next two lines of the same code block will repeat, executing forever until the program is terminated. The next line is to get the result of the input function and assign it to the variable string. The input function here will get the user input from the console, or you can see the standard input. Before input reads the user input, it prints a prompt message to the user. As you see, the prompt is please enter a string you want to print. After this prompt, after the user enters a string using the keyboard, through the input function, the Python runtime environment can obtain the user input, then assign it to the string variable. Then the last line is to print the variable string to the console, or standard output. It completes the echo program in Python. How to run this program? The bottom right screenshot gives you a demo of how it works. The source code was saved into a file called yinshencheng.py. Please notice here the extension of the Python source code file is always .py as a convention. As you can see here, it is started by Python 3 yinshencheng.py. After that, it starts running. Firstly, it prints a prompt. That is, please enter a string you want to print. And then the user enters, I like eating apple. The program will print the same string. After that, if you remember the always true loop in the source code, because of it, the next iteration starts, so you see the prompt again. This time the user inputs thank you, so the program just prints thank you. This would be repeated forever before you manually terminate it. Then the second example is about Fibonacci series. The requirement is to calculate the sum of the Fibonacci series of a given length. Firstly, what is the Fibonacci series? Fibonacci series is a number series. That is, the number of the index 0 is 0, and the number of the index 1 is 1. And for all the indexes after 0 and 1, the number of each index equals the sum of the two numbers before it. For example, the number on index 2 is the sum of the first two numbers. That is the number of index 0 and that of index 1. So 0 plus 1 equals 1. After the number of index 3 equals the sum of 1 and 1. That's 2. Repeating this, you can see the series is something like 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, etc. Next, we can write a program to calculate the sum of the first n numbers in the Fibonacci series. The source code is on the right. The first line is the same. It is to set the coding format to UTF-8. Then we first define a variable n. It means the given index of the Fibonacci series. We use the input function to ask for the user to input the number. As you know now, it gives you a prompt input n, then reads the user input from the standard input of the keyboard. One thing we have to know here is the input function returns a string, but the variable n needs to be an integer since it is the index. So we have to convert the string type into the int type. Then we can assign it to the variable n. That completes the second line. Then the third line and the fourth line. A equals 0 and B equals 1. They're the first two elements of the Fibonacci series. We can see we're using 0 and 1 to initialize the variables A and B. After that, in the fifth line, we initialize the variable sum with 0, because when n equals 0, the sum is 0. It is the initial state. After that, we can traverse the n numbers of Fibonacci sequences through for I in range n. For each index, sum adds the current number A and assign it to sum. After that, we shift to the next index. So to assign a number on the next index, which is B, to be the current number, and assign the sum of A and B to be the next number. Through such a loop, we can finally calculate the sum of the Fibonacci series until the index n. Then at the last line, the sum is finally printed. You can see the usage of the print function here. This is one way to print the concatenation of multiple strings in Python. With all these, we complete the sum of the first n Fibonacci series. Lesson 1. Coding Demo. Before, we already talked about the basic and general knowledge of Python, mainly included the birth of this language, its evolution history, characteristics, and how to set up Python developing environment in ECS. Then, we gave two simple demos, which were examples of Echo. Now we start introducing how we perform some demos on this Python environment based on ECS, so that everyone can have a direct understanding. First, we need to install Python. Here is a Linux environment. On top of Linux, we use yum install python 3 command to install Python 3. But here, Python 3 is already available in this operation system. And the download takes some time. We will not uninstall it and install it again. Assume we just finished the installation of Python 3 here. If we want to enter Python environment, which is Python shell, we just input Python 3 and enter. In this way, we get into Python 3 environment, and we can find the version is 371. Moreover, we can use help function to look for some basic information. Let's use help function to have a look. We will see at the beginning of Python shell, there are 3 arrows. If we type help, we will get inside of the help shell. It lists some website addresses of Python's courses. It also lists the modules and the keywords, etc. We can use the command to look for the corresponding information. For example, if we wanted what keywords are in Python, we just use help command to get this. Python language has 31 keywords in total. In lesson 2, I will elaborate the meaning of each keyword. Now we can have a look. For example, the keyword of class. It will be used when we claim or define a category in Python. Next example, keyword of continue. It may be used when we want a cycle structure. Its meaning is, if current condition is satisfied, this will continue execution. I will skip the rest of keywords explanation. In order to demo the coding basics in Python shell, let's create the help environment. Then we type quit and press enter. Then we get back to Python shell environment. Let me demo how to print a string. Python has a print function, which is called print. For example, we want to print hello world. This is a string. We use double or single quotation marks to embrace the string. Press enter, then we will see it. In Python shell, it can print the string like this. If we want to print hello Python with single quotation mark, it will print the string of hello Python. We can also use Python to do calculation. For example, we define 2 variables as integer and calculate the sum of the 2 variables. First, we define a equals to 10 and b equals to 11 and press enter. At this time, 2 variables a and b and their values are reserved in Python environment. When coding, we should have some good habits. For example, when I define variable a, I put a space before equal sign, then assign a as 10. On the both sides of the equal sign, I put a space. Actually, this space is optional, but I usually will put the space before and after equal sign in order to keep the coding clean and neat. Now let's calculate the sum of a and b. We define another variable called sum. Sum equals to a plus b. When we press enter, we do not know what the value is of sum. If we want to show the value on the console, we can use print function. We type print sum, and we will see the value of 10 plus 11 is 21. This is a simple calculation. Let's define a string and get the specific character under the index. Okay, define the string as string1, and it equals to I like Python. If we want to get the character of this string, we can use string index approach. For example, we define substring equals to string1. If we want to get the first 2 characters, it is 0, 2. This will be explained later. Let's look at this substring. What characters will it contain? Let's show it through print function. We find there is only 1 character, which is capital I. Why is that? Because in Python, string index starts from 0, which means the first character's index is 0. Then we get from 0, and we actually only get 0 and 1. Index 2 will not be got. Then it actually printed two characters. One is I, another is space. In computer, space is also a character. It is null character. Now if we define substring equals to string 1, 0, 3, which means we get the three characters of 1, 0, 2. What is it? It can be foreseen. It should be capital I, space, and a lowercase l. Let's look at the result of print, substring, I, space, and l. Here needs to pay attention when assign the values to one variable twice. In Python, if it is in the same environment and it is a local variable, the second assignment will override the first one. So the substring became I, space, and l. How can we cut the string according to space? Let's define a variable called a string list. And a string list equals to string1.split. Split is a Python function to cut a string, which needs to input a parameter. This parameter indicates what character will be used for cutting. Here, the parameter is a space, bracketed by double quotation mark. Then let's see what the value is a string list. We print the string list and we find the result is I like Python. The string was cut per space. There should be three words. First is I, second is like, the third is Python. What is the meaning of it bracketed by square brackets? This is a kind of data structure called a list. If a string is cut, the result is a list. In this list, there are three elements. Every element is a string. Why do we say there are strings? Because they are bracketed by single quotation marks. These three elements correspond to three words. Now we complete the string cutting. This is the interactive coding environment of Python shell. Actually, this interactive coding environment will not be often used during Python development because it cannot code a big scope business program. And when we exit from Python shell, all the variables are vanished. They will not be stored, which means they're actually stored in RAM. Now we can have a test. Let's exit the programming environment of Python shell. We can use exit function. Press enter. Then we exit and get into Linux bin shell user interface. We get into shell environment again through command Python 3 and check if those variables values assigned before still exist. We use print function to check it. For example, let's print A. Error occurs. Report name error, which means there is no such variable called A defined. So when we exit from Python shell, all the variables we defined are cleared. Let's check variable string list. It is odd to not exist or defined either. That's why we say the Python shell environment is actually for learning Python program language, not for real development. Okay, let's exit. Now let's move to IPython interactive programming environment. What is IPython? Its installation is actually to install a toolbox in Python environment. So we do not need to use the installation tool of Linux, such as yum or apt. Then what should we use? We will use a package management tool of Python itself. It is called pip. Since I am using the branch of Python 3, so I will use pip3. We type pip3, press enter to install IPython. Through this command, IPython will be installed in current Python environment. Here, IPython was already installed in my computer, and its corresponding tool packages such as Jedi were also installed. So in my computer, the IPython is already available. Then how to get into this environment? First, we need to execute environment variable. After installing IPython, environment variable needs to configure. For example, define those binary tool packages needed by IPython into the environment variable. We can use a source command to generate the corresponding environment variable and its value in this session. Then it can be sourced. At this time, we only need to input IPython to get into IPython's shell user interface. Factually, IPython's coding environment and style is identical to Python shell, but IPython can memorize the lines of your coding and all the print results, which will be shown in a different way. For example, we still print hello world in IPython environment. We can find that I have printed out the string of hello world. Of course, it has its own help function as well. Print it out, we will find that this environment is the same as Python shell. Print information is the same too. Now let's check what keywords it has. Type keywords. It shows identical 31 keywords. If we want to quit, it is the same as before. In this environment, let's try an addition calculation. Assign A equals to 100. Let's make a change. Try division. Assign B equals to 10 and C equals to A slash B. In Python, slash means division. A slash B, assign the quotient to C. Let's check what the value is of C. Print C, and we find the value is 10.0 instead of 10. Due to division, the default result is a floating number, not integer. No matter if A or B is an integer, the result is always 10.0 as a floating number. Let's demo an error division by 0. Assign A equals to 100 and B equals to 0, C equals to A slash B. We know 0 cannot be denominator. If a programmer assigns a denominator as 0 by accident, what will happen? After pressing enter, we will see an error as 0 division error. This is abnormal operation. In Lesson 3, we will talk about abnormal information of Python. Now we only need to understand that there will be a lot of errors during coding. Now how can we exit IPython environment? So we still use exit command. Press enter. Then we exit from IPython environment. So here is general demonstration of this interactive programming environment in a third-party environment, IPython. Now we see in Python how to do some simple calculation, string printing, and the index and the split of the string. Okay, that is all for this lesson, and the detailed knowledge will be elaborated in the following courses. Thank you.